Final count, about 5,000 words. A deadbolt slammed home on the other side of the door. A hand rattled the knob. It didn't turn. An old man pressed his palm flat against the wood and knocked 3 slow times. Nothing. He knocked again, harder, until the storm door shook in its frame. Inside, a curtain moved. A young man's face appeared, looked at him, and turned away. The old man's wife stood behind him on the porch, gripping a cardboard box of photographs against her chest. Her hands were shaking. Outside, snow was starting to fall. This was the house Walter Coleman had paid off with 30 years of a teacher's salary, and the man who just locked him out of it was his only son. Walter was 71 years old, and he had nowhere to sleep that night. What that couple found 6 weeks later would change everything. Stay with me on this one. Now, let me back up and tell you how 2 retired school teachers ended up standing in the snow, locked out of the house they'd raised their boy in. Walter Coleman taught history at Harlan Junction High for 34 years. His wife Ruth taught 3rd grade down the road for almost as long. If you grew up in that little town in southern Missouri any time after 1970, chances are one of the Colemans taught you to read, or taught you what the Missouri Compromise was, or caught you passing notes and made you stay after class. They weren't rich. Teachers in Harlan Junction never were, but they paid their bills on time, kept a clean porch, and never asked anybody for a thing. They had one son, Gavin. And they loved that boy the way you love a late child, an only child, the one you thought you'd never get to have. Ruth was 40 when Gavin came along. They gave him everything. Braces they couldn't afford, a used car for his 16th birthday, 4 years of college, paid in full so he wouldn't start his life underwater the way so many kids do. And here's the thing about giving a child everything. Sometimes it teaches them that everything is owed. Gavin grew up, moved 2 hours away to Springfield, got into real estate. He married a woman named Charla who liked new kitchens and new cars, and who looked at Walter and Ruth's little brick house the way a buyer looks at a lot. Not as a home, as square footage, as a number. For a few years, things were fine. Then Ruth got sick. Not dying sick, not yet, but her heart wasn't strong, and the doctors said she needed a procedure that Medicare only halfway covered. Walter and Ruth had savings, around $40,000, scraped together over a lifetime of coupons and cold lunches and cars driven until the wheels nearly fell off. That money was their whole cushion against the world. That's when Gavin showed up with a plan. He sat at their kitchen table, smooth about it, the way he'd learned to be smooth with clients. He said the house was old, too much for them to keep up. The smart move, the modern move, was to put the house in his name for tax reasons. So the nursing home couldn't take it someday. He'd already had the papers drawn up. Walter didn't like it. Something in his gut turned over, but Ruth trusted her boy. And Gavin held his mother's hand and said, "Mama, I would never let anything happen to you." So they signed. They put the deed to their own home into their son's name, and they wrote him a check for part of that savings, too, to cover what he called closing costs and legal fees. You already know where this is going. I wish I didn't have to tell you. 6 months later, the phone calls stopped getting answered as fast. Charla wanted to renovate her own house. Gavin's business hit a rough patch. And one cold morning in November of 2019, Gavin drove down to Harlan Junction with a locksmith in the truck behind him, and he changed every lock on the house his parents had lived in for 40 years. He told them it was temporary. He told them they'd be more comfortable in a little apartment across town, and wasn't it lucky he happened to own one. He told them a lot of things, but the truth was simple. The house was worth money and his parents were in the way of it, so there they stood, on the porch, in the snow, Walter with a box of tools he'd grabbed on his way out, Ruth with a box of photographs. And at their feet, whining and pressing against Ruth's ankle, an old fat beagle named Cricket, 13 years old, gray around the muzzle, who had no idea why the people she loved were suddenly standing outside their own front door. That night, they slept in the little apartment Gavin owned, and Walter lay awake staring at a water stain on the ceiling, and he made himself a promise. He wasn't going to spend whatever years he had left being small. He wasn't going to let his boy make him small. He had one thing left. A little more of that savings tucked in an account Gavin didn't know about because Walter had never quite trusted the whole arrangement. About $38,000, and he had an idea that had been sitting in the back of his mind for 50 years. Just outside town, off the old county road, there was a drive-in movie theater, the Starlight. It had been closed since Walter was a young man, the screen gone gray, the lot grown over with weeds, the projection booth boarded up and forgotten. Walter had worked there once as a teenager, running the projector for a strange, quiet man named Amos Rourke who owned the place. It was the best summer of his life. And ever since, Ruth had said the same thing every time they drove past it. She'd say, "I always wanted to see a movie there, Walt, under the stars, before we're too old." Well, they were getting too old, and Walter decided right there in that borrowed apartment that he was going to give his wife that one thing before her heart gave out, whatever it cost him. What did he have left to lose? That's what he was thinking. But Walter had no idea what was waiting behind that projection booth wall. The Starlight had been closed for almost 50 years, and you could tell. The marquee out front had lost half its letters, so it just said ARITE in rusted metal. The big screen leaned a few degrees off true, streaked with mildew, birds nesting in the frame. Weeds grew waist-high where 1,000 families had once parked to watch cowboys and monsters and love stories under the open Missouri sky. But the land was cheap. Nobody in Harlan Junction had wanted a broken-down drive-in in years. The bank that held it just wanted it off their books. Walter walked into that bank with a cashier's check, and he walked out the owner of 11 acres and one dead theater for the grand total of $31,000. He had about $7,000 left to his name. Ruth cried when he told her, not sad crying. She put both hands over her mouth and her eyes filled up and she said, "Walter Coleman, you old fool." And then she said, "When do we start?" They started the next morning. Now picture this. A 71-year-old man and his 68-year-old wife showing up at dawn every day in an old pickup truck with rakes and gloves and a thermos of coffee, clearing weeds out of a drive-in that time forgot. Cricket the beagle waddling behind them, sniffing every inch of that lot like it was the most interesting place on earth. And for those two it was. Word got around town the way it does. And here's the part that gets me. People started showing up. Old students of theirs. A man in his 50s who Walter had taught to love history, now a contractor, who came by on a Saturday with his sons and rewired the whole concession stand for free. A woman Ruth had taught to read in the 3rd grade, now running the diner, who brought sandwiches out to the lot every day at noon and refused to take a dime. That's a small town for you. That's what the Colemans had banked all those years without ever knowing it. Not money, people. But the heart of the place, the thing Walter cared about most, was the projection booth. It was a squat cinder block building set up on a rise at the back of the lot, and it had been locked and boarded since before Gavin was even born. The original projector was still in there, a great heavy machine of steel and glass. If Walter could get that projector running, if he could get one film to play on that screen, then Ruth would get her night under the stars. The day he finally pried the boards off the booth door and stepped inside, Walter stood very still, because it was exactly the way he remembered it. The shelves, the rewind bench, the little window looking out at the screen. He was 17 again for just a second, and then he was 71 again with a bad hip and a lost house, and he got to work. That's where Cricket started acting strange. The old dog had never been much of a barker, too fat, too tired, too content. But every time Walter brought her into that booth, She went straight to the back wall, to a section of wood paneling that had been nailed up over the cinder block. And she'd scratch at it, dig at it, whine low in her throat and look back at Walter like she was trying to tell him something. Walter shooed her off it the first few times. Old dog, he figured. Mice in the wall, maybe, but Cricket wouldn't let it go. Day after day, she went back to that panel and scratched until her nails were worn down. Until one afternoon she scratched so hard, she pulled a whole strip of the paneling loose and it fell away, and behind it Walter saw something that stopped him cold. He saw nail heads, his own nail heads, because Walter suddenly remembered with a jolt that ran all the way down his spine that he had nailed that panel up himself, 50 years ago, when he was 17 years old. Let me tell you about that. The last summer the Starlight was open, 1971, old Amos Rourke had come to Walter one night near closing and handed him a hammer and a stack of paneling and pointed at a hole in the back wall of the booth. Rourke said, "Board that up for me, son. Don't ask questions and don't tell a soul." And he pressed a $100 bill into Walter's hand, which in 1971 was more money than Walter made in 3 weeks. So Walter did it. He nailed the panel up tight and never thought another thing about it. And 2 weeks later, Amos Rourke vanished off the face of the earth. The story everybody told was that Rourke had robbed his own business blind and run off. There'd been rumors for years that the old man had come into money, big money, from something shady, land deals or worse. And then one day he was just gone, and so, people said, was every dollar he had. The Starlight closed, and that was that. For 50 years. Walter stood in that booth, looking at his own 50-year-old nail heads, and his hands started to shake. He got a pry bar. Cricket sat back on her haunches and watched him, tail thumping the concrete floor. And Walter worked that panel loose, one nail at a time, his heart going so hard he could hear it in his ears. Behind the panel was a hole in the cinder block, and set into that hole was a steel door, a little vault door painted the same gray as the wall with a dial and a handle. Walter had boarded it up without ever knowing it was there, because Rourke had already covered it with a first layer before he ever handed Walter that hammer. Walter didn't have the combination. But that door was 50 years old, and the wall around it was crumbling, and Walter had spent 6 weeks getting strong again swinging a rake. He got a sledgehammer from the truck, and he swung it at the cinder block beside that little door again and again, chips flying, until the whole frame gave way and the vault door swung open on its rusted hinges. He looked inside, and he sat down, right there on the floor because his legs wouldn't hold him. Inside that vault, stacked floor to ceiling, were bundles of cash wrapped in yellowed paper bands. There were bearer bonds, the kind that whoever holds them owns them, in denominations Walter had to read 3 times to believe. And there were deeds, land deeds, property records tucked in an oilcloth pouch for parcels all over the county and beyond. Walter didn't know it yet, sitting on that cold floor with his old dog licking his face. But he was looking at a fortune that, between the cash, the bonds, and land that 50 years of growth had turned into something almost unimaginable, was worth $260 million. That night, Walter didn't tell a soul but Ruth. He drove home and he sat her down at the little table in the borrowed apartment, and he put one single bundle of that cash in front of her, and he told her everything. And Ruth, who had a bad heart, put her hand to her chest, and Walter got scared for a second. But she wasn't having an attack. She was laughing. Laughing and crying at the same time, the two of them, 2 old teachers who'd been thrown out of their own house 6 weeks before, sitting there in the lamplight with a fortune between them. Ruth made coffee. Real coffee, not the cheap stuff. She poured 2 cups and took Walter's hand and said, "So it's over, Walt. It's really over. No more worrying, we're going to be all right." And they sat there in the quiet, sipping that coffee, believing with their whole hearts that the hard part was finally behind them. Headlights swept across the apartment window. A car pulled into the lot outside slow and stopped. An engine cut off. A door opened and shut. Ruth set her coffee down. Walter went to the window and moved the curtain, and he saw a man crossing the lot toward their door. A stranger, big man, long coat, walking with purpose, and in his hand, catching the porch light, was a manila folder thick with papers. The knock came hard, 3 times. Walter opened the door on the chain, the way you do, and the man on the step looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Mr. Coleman, Walter Coleman, my name is Dale Rourke. My grandfather was Amos Rourke. He built the Starlight Drive-In," and he pulled a photograph from the folder and held it up. It was an old black and white picture of the booth Walter had spent 6 weeks fixing. The man said, "I've been looking for what my grandfather left behind for 30 years. And I have every reason to believe you just found it." You see what happened there? A minute before, this was a story about an old couple getting a lucky break. Now, standing on that step, was a man with a bloodline claim to every dollar in that vault. This wasn't about a house anymore. This was about who that fortune belonged to, and whether Walter and Ruth would get to keep any of it at all, or lose everything a second time. Walter let him in. He could have slammed the door, called the sheriff, hidden behind that chain. But Walter Coleman had been raised right, and he'd been thrown out of his own home by his own blood just weeks before, and something in him refused to do to this stranger what Gavin had done to him. Dale Rourke sat at the little table where Ruth had just been dreaming their worries were over, and he told his story. His grandfather Amos had made money, a lot of it, in ways that weren't all clean back in the 60s. Land deals, some gambling money, some things Dale didn't fully know. But before he could enjoy any of it, some very dangerous men had come looking for a cut. So Amos hid everything, told no one, and planned to lie low until it blew over. He nailed his fortune into the wall of the one place nobody would think to look, his own dead drive-in, and he covered his tracks by having a teenage projectionist board over the vault without knowing what was behind it. And then, before he could ever come back for it, Amos Rourke had a heart attack in a motel 2 states away and died alone, under a false name, and took the secret with him. For 50 years, that money sat in the wall, and for 30 of those years, Dale, his grandson, had chased rumors and old records trying to find it because Dale needed it, not the way Gavin wanted money. Dale had a daughter 8 years old named Lily, and Lily had been born with a heart defect, and there was a surgery, an experimental one, that could save her life, and it cost more than Dale would make in 20 years driving trucks. He laid Lily's medical file on the table next to the property records. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't demanding. He just laid it out and said, "I'm not here to take anything from you that isn't mine. But if my grandfather left something in that booth, some of it belongs to my little girl. And I'm begging you. She doesn't have much time. Now hold on. Because this is where you find out what kind of people Walter and Ruth Coleman really were." Ruth got up from the table. She walked over and looked at that little girl's photograph clipped to the file, a gap-toothed kid with pigtails, and Ruth's own bad heart just about broke. And she looked at Walter, and Walter looked at her, and 50 years of marriage passed between them in one glance without a single word. Because here's the truth. That money was never really theirs. Legally, it was a gray mess, tangled up in a 50-year-old disappearance and land law and a dozen questions no lawyer could answer overnight. But morally, Walter had nailed that panel shut for Amos Rourke with his own 2 hands. He'd been part of hiding it, and now Amos Rourke's great-granddaughter was dying, and the answer to whether she lived was sitting in a cinder-block wall on Walter's land. Walter reached across the table and put his hand on Dale Rourke's arm. And he said, "Son, your grandfather trusted me with that wall once. I think maybe it's time I earned it. We're going to make this right, all of it. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this one about ordinary people doing the right thing when nobody's making them are the whole reason this channel exists, and I've got a lot more of them to tell you. Now let's get back to it because the hardest part is still coming. The next morning, before Walter could even get to a lawyer, another car pulled into the drive-in lot. It was Gavin. Word had gotten around town, the way it always does. Somebody had seen the old couple hauling something out of the booth. Somebody had mentioned it at the diner. And it had traveled the 2 hours to Springfield and reached the one set of ears that would light up like a slot machine. Gavin came roaring up the county road in his big truck, climbed out with a grin on his face that made Walter's stomach turn, threw his arms wide and said, "Dad, Dad, I heard the news. This is incredible. I always knew you had it in you. 6 weeks. 6 weeks since that same young man had changed the locks on his parents' house and left them standing in the snow. And now here he was, calling his father Dad again like the word cost nothing. Gavin didn't even try to hide it. He walked straight to the booth. He wanted to see the vault. He was already talking fast about lawyers, about the smart way to structure this, and he kept saying we as if there had ever been a we. He talked about offshore accounts. He talked about how the money should really be protected in a trust, and wouldn't you know it, he knew just how to set one up, and it would be safest if it was all in his name. In his name. Same words, same smile, same trap that had stolen their house. Ruth stood in the doorway of that booth and watched her son, her only child, the boy she'd rocked to sleep and paid 4 years of college for, circle that vault like a buzzard. And you could see the exact moment her heart finished breaking. It didn't come with tears. It came quiet. She just nodded, slow, like she was finally understanding something she'd spent years refusing to see. Walter let him talk. He let Gavin lay the whole thing out, every greedy piece of it. And then Walter said, "Gavin, I want you to meet somebody." And Dale Rourke stepped out of the shadows at the back of the booth. Walter said, "This is Dale. His grandfather owned this land and everything hidden in it. And Dale's got a little girl who's sick. And your mother and I have already decided. Most of what's in that wall is going to save her life. What's left is going to this town, to the school, to the diner, to the people who showed up with sandwiches and free wiring when we had nothing, the people who remembered us when our own son wouldn't answer the phone." Gavin's face changed then. The grin curdled. He started to argue. He said they were being taken advantage of. He said this Rourke was a con man. He said, "That's my inheritance you're giving away to strangers." And Walter, quiet, steady Walter, who'd never raised his voice at that boy in his life, took one step forward and said the truest thing anybody ever said to Gavin Coleman. He said, "You locked us out in the snow, son. You took our house. You made your mother sign away her own home. You had your inheritance. It was us. And you threw us out with the trash. A man doesn't get to abandon his parents and then come collect when their number comes up. You want to know what you inherited from me? You inherited nothing. And whose fault is that?" Gavin stood there, and for 1 second, 1 single second, something flickered behind his eyes. Shame, maybe. Or the memory of who he used to be before the money and the marriage and the wanting swallowed him whole. But it passed. It always does with men like that. His jaw set. He looked at his father and his mother and the dying girl's photograph in Dale's hand, and he saw only what he was losing, nothing else. He turned and walked back to his truck and drove off, spitting gravel, and he did not look back. Ruth watched him go, and Walter put his arm around her. And she leaned into him and said, very softly, "We raised him better than that, Walt." And Walter said, "I know we did, honey. Some people just decide who they're going to be. And there's not a thing love can do about it." That was the last time they ever saw Gavin as a son. Not because they closed the door on him, because he never came back through it. Now, let me tell you what they did with $260 million. They did it all above board. Walter found an honest lawyer, an old former student naturally, and they spent months untangling the legal knots. The bearer bonds were valid. The land deeds, cross-checked against county records, held up. And because of how it all shook out, the estate of Amos Rourke had a rightful heir, and that heir was Dale. Walter and Ruth could have fought for a bigger share. Any court in the land would have given the finders a substantial cut. But they didn't want a fortune. They'd never wanted a fortune. So they took what they needed to live out their days without fear, enough to buy back their own house free and clear, and never worry about a bill again. And they signed the rest over to where it belonged. Lily Rourke had her surgery 4 months later at a hospital in St. Louis. It worked. That gap-toothed little girl with the pigtails, the one whose photograph broke Ruth's heart at a kitchen table, walked out of that hospital on her own 2 feet with a heart that would carry her a good long life. Dale Rourke never forgot it. Every birthday of Lily's for the rest of the Colemans' lives, there was a card in the mailbox, and it always said the same thing at the bottom. Because of you, she's still here. And the town. Oh, the town. The Colemans set up a fund, right there in Harlan Junction, out of what remained, and it was still more money than that little town had ever seen. The high school got a new roof and a real library. The diner woman who'd brought sandwiches every day got her back taxes paid and never knew who did it. The contractor who'd rewired the booth for free found his son's college tuition quietly taken care of. Walter and Ruth spent their last years giving back to the town that had given to them, one quiet gift at a time. But you want to know the real ending. I can see it. You want to know about the movie. Walter finished the projector. Of course he did. He'd been fixing it all along, in between everything else and the summer after Lily's surgery, on a warm night in June with the stars thick overhead. The Starlight Drive-In opened its gates for the first time in almost 50 years. Not as a business, just for one night. Free. The whole town came. Cars filled that lot, station wagons and pickups and a school bus full of kids, headlights winding up the county road just like the old days. The concession stand sold popcorn, and the diner woman ran it, and nobody paid for a thing. Dale and Lily drove in from St. Louis, and Lily sat on the hood of her daddy's truck with a paper cup of popcorn, alive, laughing, her repaired heart beating strong under the same stars. And up in the booth, Walter Coleman threaded the film through that great old machine, the way Amos Rourke had taught him 50 years before. His hands remembered. They always do. And he flipped the switch, and the projector hummed to life, and a beam of white light shot across the dark and hit that big screen he'd scrubbed clean with his own hands. Down below, in the front row, in 2 folding chairs set right there on the gravel because she couldn't stand the whole time, sat Ruth Coleman, with an old fat beagle named Cricket asleep in her lap, the dog who'd started all of it, the dog who'd scratched at a 50-year-old wall until the whole world changed. Walter came down from the booth and sat in the empty chair beside his wife. And Ruth reached over and took his hand in the dark, the way she had 10,000 times across a lifetime, and she watched a movie play under the open Missouri sky. The one thing she'd wanted. The one thing she'd said every time they drove past that broken-down lot for 40 years. Before we're too old, Walt. Before we're too old. They weren't too old. They'd made it. Just barely, and by way of a road neither of them could ever have imagined, but they'd made it. Ruth turned to Walter, and her eyes were shining in the light off the screen, and she said, "Thank you, Walt." And Walter, who'd been locked out of his own house in the snow not 1 year before, who'd lost his son and found a fortune and given nearly all of it away, looked at his wife's face lit up like a girl's, and he understood something. The vault behind that wall had held $260 million, and it had never once been the treasure. The treasure was right here. It always had been. It was the woman holding his hand, and the town filling that lot, and a little girl alive on the hood of a truck, and a good old dog asleep and dreaming. Gavin missed all of it. He got the house he'd wanted in the end, because his parents let him keep the deed to their old brick home rather than fight him in court. They didn't need it. They'd bought it back. But they let him have that one thing, the thing he'd betrayed them for, and I think that was the cruelest kindness of all, because he had to live the rest of his life knowing exactly what he traded it for. He got a house, and he lost every single thing that ever made a house worth having. Walter and Ruth Coleman lived 6 more years after that night. Good years. Cricket passed first in her sleep, an old dog who done more good in this world than most people ever do. And when folks in Harlan Junction talk about the Colemans now, they don't talk about the money. They talk about 2 teachers who got thrown away by their own boy, and who chose, when the whole world was finally handed to them, to give it to a dying child and a dying town instead. That's the story. A fist on a locked door in the snow and a hand held under the stars. That's the whole distance a life can travel if you keep your heart pointed the right way. Stay good to the people who stayed good to you. And every now and then, listen to the old dog scratching at the wall. She just might know something you don't.